So good afternoon, everybody. We are here today to participate, witness the public examination of Daniel Landau's dissertation, Becoming Other, Virtual Embodiment, Blurring the Self and Other Bound Binary. As the opponent or public examiner, we have Professor Mel Slater from Universitat de Barcelona. As the custos appointed by the Doctoral Program Committee of Aalto University School of Arts, Design and Architecture, I declare this public examination open.
Okay. Honored custos, honored opponent, ladies and gentlemen. In this short presentation, I will provide a short summary of my doctoral research, Becoming Other, Virtual Embodiment, Blurring the Self-Other Binary. This research is contextualized within the context of interdisciplinary field of art and science, an emerging field broadening the scope of knowledge, sources of producing and sharing knowledge, addressing broad, complex societal phenomena. The structure of this talk is going to be as following. First, I'm going to be talking about the relationship between body, self, and other. Next, I'm going to talk about the complex and very interesting phenomena of empathy. Following that, I'll be talking about the relationship between technology and self. Then I will be talking about and describing a few of the research projects, and conclude with application and future research. So, what does it mean to have a body or being embodied? Owning a body is a complex integration between the body's physical presence and its neural map in the brain. Embodiment has three aspects: self-location, knowing where the body is; agency, the ability to tell the body what to do; and body ownership, the subjective feeling of the body that it belongs to you. How about being or having a self? How do we know that the self actually exists? What is the fundamental difference between self and other? The self-other binary is probably one of the most basic constructs of human consciousness and identity, suggesting that the existence of another, which is different than the self, permits the recognition or possibility of a self. The study of selfhood spans many disciplines, such as neuroscience, psychology, and philosophy. But one thing is clear: there is no consensus regarding what that actually is. I'd like to describe three levels of selfhood my research relates to as anchors. We have the minimal self. It's the most fundamental part of self-concept. It is a pre-reflective, bodily, implicit self-awareness that characterizes our waking life and from infancy onward. The metacognitive self is the process of being able to think about oneself. It is becoming aware that although we are separate and distinct objects and entities or being, we also exist in the world. The narrative self is the stories that we tell of ourselves, the sum of the events, interactions that accumulate throughout our life, establishing who we are. So I would go so far that self as a construct itself doesn't really exist as a thing, but rather I would like to propose that it's an aggregation of models and processes. So what about the other? The divide between the self and others is one of the most fundamental gaps in human experience. Sartre's famous claim, hell is other people, pointing out to the impossibility for one ever to know what is in the mind of others. But then comes the most unique human ability, which is empathy, a unique bridge between self and other. What is empathy? Empathy is a mental ability to bridge the subjective feeling of an individual towards someone else. It could be experiencing his feelings on an emotional level, could be even feeling pain on a more neural level. In 2015, the VR creator Chris Mill claimed in his TED appearance that VR is a magical empathy machine. So beyond my initial rejection of the techno-fix approach, that technology is a fix for complex societal and human challenges, the question asks, that raises is, can VR place people, or as VR can place people in the shoes of an experience of others? And later I will show that not only through the experience and environment and perspective of others, you can also experience the other body. Is it really a magical empathy machine? Research in the field has shown that inducing empathy is far more complex. It's the very question that my main research question went out to investigate. Can VR bridge between self and other, us and them? So where's the technology in this puzzle? Between image reproducing technologies, intelligence systems, and extensive tracking and monitoring technologies, where does the machine end and the person begin? Since the ancient reflection surfaces to advanced information technologies, the interaction between self and technology begs the question, what is an identifiable self that emerges through technology? How is advanced technology reshaping private and social identity within society? How do individuals define and navigate their identity within our online culture? And with the co-evolution of self and technology, what should we expect from the emerging technology of virtual reality? One of the most exciting applications of VR is virtual embodiment. If virtual reality elicits the illusion of being somewhere else, virtual embodiment is an illusion that brings you inside a virtual body, experiencing another person's body. So far, this illusion is achieved by placing participants in a full body tracking suit mapped on a computer-generated body. I will later show a unique virtual embodiment technique based on immersive video. We could later discuss in depth the technical and ontological differences between these techniques. To understand how this illusion is achieved, I refer to the classic rubber hand illusion study. It is based on having a participant placing his hands on a table while one hand is obscured and placed slightly to the side. The rubber hand is placed instead of where the hidden hand should have been. The experimenter then simultaneously strokes both the rubber hand and the corresponding parts of the covered real hand. The study showed that it takes as little as 30 seconds for participants to feel that they own the rubber hand, as if it was their own. One of the early virtual embodiment experiments was made by VR pioneer Yaron Lanier, when he had participants embodied in the body of a lobster somewhere in the 1980s. Since the late 90s, virtual embodiment has been explored extensively. Among the virtual embodiment effects that have been studied are age, gender, and race. It has been proven that virtual embodiment can impact cognition, emotions, attitudes, and behavior. For example, Mel Slater in 2013 showed that having participants embodied in the body of a child will change its perception of size. Rosenberg and Bailinson that same year showed that embodying a participant in the body of a superhero will change his behavior into a more pro-social behavior. Moving on to my research projects, I would just like to state that each project tried to answer a well-defined component, trying to put together the puzzle, understanding the following research questions. The first research question: what is the impact of virtual reality and virtual embodiment experiences on the self-other gap? Second research question is, what does this impact mean for art installation, narrative storytelling, and social interventions? First experiment is a media comparison study, exploring VR and its benefits over traditional video in inducing empathy. We filmed a 360 stereoscopic video of a person disclosing a personal, autobiographical, painful story from his past. This empathy eliciting video was presented either in VR or on a computer screen. Autonomic and facial responses were recorded both from the target in the video and from participants who viewed the video. The findings: VR condition enhanced empathetic care in viewers, increasing the wish to elevate the target's suffering, of course, compared to the 2D video. The VR condition exhibited higher levels of facial synchronicity with the target, which is a clear indication of social connection. And lastly, the VR condition elicited higher levels of social presence, which mediated the effects of VR on empathetic care, as well as facial synchronicity with the target. Next study, we went from a personal sphere to the more societal level, and we explored perspective taking. So this experiment is a non-embodied, immersive perspective taking media comparison study as well. So perspective taking is a process by which an individual views a situation from another point of view. So if empathy is more emotional, perspective taking is more cognitive. It is essential for improving intergroup relations, but it is very difficult to implement in violent conflicts. In 2 studies, Jewish Israelis watched a 360 VR scene depicting an Israeli-Palestinian confrontation from different points of views, the out group and the in group. Study 1 compared immersive perspective taking and traditional perspective taking. Study 2 was conducted at 2 time points of 5 months differences to examine whether immersive perspective taking has long-lasting effect on general perception of the outgroup and in real life intergroup events. The findings: experiencing in-group aggression from the perspective of the outgroup increases empathy towards the outgroup compared to seeing the same scenario from the in-group's perspective. So in our case, I'll reiterate how it was manifested. As Israeli subject experienced the scenario from the perspective of Palestinian, experiencing their own aggression has increased empathy. And a very astounding finding, we found that this effect was still prevalent 5 months after the experiment, which is a clear indication where lab experiments can easily become a source of inspiration and actual societal meaning to be an intervention for general public, for general purposes, and kind of combining the internal validity and external validity of these methods. The next study started as an art project, aiming to explore the vocabulary and grammar of virtual embodiment for storytelling. I set out to develop a unique virtual embodiment method using immersive video technique. In order to produce a first-person view of a virtual body, a human actor is filmed in first-person perspective, who later serves as the virtual body of the participant. The actor is filmed by placing a stereoscopic 180-degree camera in front of his or her eyes. The key advantages for this method: the actual visual result is photorealistic. This experience, while seeing tactile information in the virtual environment, an experimenter synchronously, same as the rubber hand experience, produces human touch with all its qualities. Lastly, I would say that it's an easy to administrate virtual embodiment technique. The key disadvantage is that participants do not have agency, since experiencing a pre-recorded stimulation which is not interactive. I will, however, mention that this, in a later study, has been developed and overcome this limitation. In the art project, I had participants experience 3 different ages: a 7-year-old, a 25-year-old, and an 80-year-old. I wanted to explore the impact of such a time progression. From the very first runs, it was clear that the experience had significant impact on participants, with many of them experiencing intense emotions. I realized that this type of impact needs careful investigation and set out to run this as an empirical study. We divided the experience into two conditions and randomly assigned 80 participants into either a 25-year-old body or an 80-year-old body. The findings. The 180 stereoscopic video can provide an effective technique to induce experiences of virtual embodiment. The first results showed that participants did accept a photorealistic virtual body as their own. And the technique can alter perception's cognition. We tested time perception. With the knowledge of empathetic impact of meeting a face-to-face person in virtual reality, as well as the impact of perspective taking and its long-term effect, I was extremely happy to receive an invitation to produce an art installation for Israel Museum. It was a great opportunity for me to realize my lab work and have it extended to the general public. This is my ultimate goal. In this exhibition, I wanted both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to meet the enemy. In a documentary production, I visited a religious Jewish family and a Palestinian family living less than a kilometer away, but separated not only by a physical wall, but living separate realities with no chance of a physical encounter. The art installation included a split realization of the two living rooms. The images on the right are documentary screen grabs of the Arab family on top and the Jewish family on the bottom. And on the left side, you can see the reconstructed living room in the gallery space. The next project I'll be presenting is a radical intervention enabling a person to meet himself in virtual reality, hold his own hands, and look into his own eyes. The motivation here was the notion that being able to practice empathy to others begins with the ability to practice empathy towards oneself, being able to practice self-compassion. The first realization of this project was piloted as an art project in November 2017 in a film festival in Frankfurt. Later, we ran it as a full empirical study during the summer of 2019. The empirical study is not included in this dissertation. The intervention included 2 sessions. So participant came into the first session and the first recording session and followed a series of actions. The first action would be entering, P, the participant, meeting the experimenter, and performing a mirror game sequence. The confederate, sitting behind a 180-degree stereoscopic camera, was there providing a first-person perspective body with his hands covered. Next, the participant would sit in front of the confederate, look into his eyes, and hold his hands. Lastly, we would ask the participant to sit himself behind the 180-degree stereoscopic camera and perform another mirror game with the experimenter. At this point, the participant did not know anything about what he should expect in the second session. 3 to 7 weeks later, we invited the participants into a viewing session, which went as following. Participant, sitting in the same gallery, in the same space, in the same design, wearing a virtual reality headset, would see the virtual experimenter and perform with her a mirror game. At that point, the participant is embodied in his own body. And here I would mention that due to the implementation of this technique, he is producing agency experience because he is moving his hands in perfect synchronicity to the hand movement he recorded in the first session. The experimenter leaves the room, and then she enters back to the room with the virtual participant. At that point, the participant is sitting, experiencing first person, his own body. Here the hands are covered, and the body swap manipulation was applied. And next, he would find the virtual participant sit in front of him, holding his hand, where the experimenter would physically produced that tactile experience, look in the eyes, and we played back a self-compassion intervention by psychologist Christine Neff. Future research and applications. The next step, I want to develop and validate a virtual effacement technique. For my research, this is a natural progression using video and making not only a generalized virtual embodiment experience, but actually making it very specific one, a specific person, a specific time, and a specific relationship between the subject and the target. Knowledge obtained in presented studies may help produce effective experiences for art, therapy, education, and social impact interventions. Social interactions in VR may play a significant role in post-COVID reality. I will further explore the private and societal benefits of social interactions in VR, including virtual embodiment experience. I ask you, honored opponent, appointed by the doctoral program committee of the School of Arts, Design and Architecture, to present the critical comments on the dissertations you find well-founded.
Right. We're going to ask the audience to bear with us a moment. We would like to see if we can get Professor Slater on the screen. So if you could give us a couple of minutes that he can reboot his computer, then so we can see if get his video image. Thank you. Good to see you, Mel. Welcome.
Okay, you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so okay, that's never happened before with Zoom, but there's always a first time. Okay, do I start now?
Yes.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you very much for your presentation and for the thesis, and also for inviting me, dear candidate. And I would like to make some comments, and then in the comments, I will also pose the questions that I will ask later. So there are several different types of virtual reality. One of them, the one that you've concentrated on, is referred to as 180 degrees or 360 degrees VR, virtual reality, which is based on video. I'll call it from now on video VR. And in this, the images are created through photographs or video, and these images are mapped onto the inside of a cylinder or a sphere that surrounds the participant in VR. So the participant wearing a head-mounted display can look in any direction and see these images and be immersed in the alternative world that's portrayed. However, since the video is fixed once and for all at the time of capture, the participant cannot interact within the scenario except through changing viewpoints. And in this, even the only type of viewpoint changes that can be done are head rotations. And head rotations will result in updates to the images seen in the head-mounted display. So imagine you're in the inside of a sphere or a cylinder with images or video painted on it, and you're just looking around inside. But if you move your head, nothing will happen. If you translate your head, nothing will happen. The images won't change. Of course, this can be in stereo or mono, depending on the way that the images are captured. But this thesis, on the technical side, is fundamentally concerned with bridging the gap between video-based and model-based VR. So it demonstrates a series of techniques where, to some extent, interaction is made possible even with a video-based VR. So a particular as was pointed out, a particular fundamental difference between video and model-based VR is that in model-based VR, the idea of embodiment is very easily supported. So a participant in the VR can be endowed with a life-size, computer graphics generated virtual body. And the important thing is that this can move in real time through body tracking and updates of the graphic scenario following movements of the participant. So when the participant looks down towards him or herself, they'll see a virtual body. They can also see it in a mirror. And if, for example, they move one of their limbs, they'll see those limbs moving, the virtual limbs moving in the virtual reality. So this is not directly possible in video VR because the video is fixed once and for all. So the thesis shows demonstrations of how, nevertheless, it is possible to some extent in video-based VR to achieve embodiment, including techniques that allow real-time movement and the sense of body ownership that's typically generated by virtual reality embodiment. So the thesis presents a number of research studies that show video VR can be used to promote perspective taking and empathy, in particular to address deep-seated conflicts between peoples, such as the one that was described between Jewish and Arab, Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. The thesis goes on to show that a type of embodiment is possible in video VR, even interacting with oneself, and concludes with this application of embodiment. Then, so basically, the new scientific knowledge and artistic creation is that the thesis describes a new methodology for the achievement of types of interaction in video VR, including the issue of embodiment. I would say that the techniques used are ingenious, and it's got a strong artistic and creative component. It also includes, the thesis also includes scientific papers that that demonstrate how the techniques have been used to further knowledge, especially with respect to perspective taking and empathy in the context of conflict. The thesis clearly demonstrates these new findings. I find it, for example, quite remarkable that an approximately 1 minute experience of the checkpoint scenario can result in measurable changes of attitudes several months after the experience. So it's in line with other findings, but I think it's never been accomplished with the rigor using video-based VR that this shows. I mean, there's many demonstrations of empathy types of applications using video-based VR, but none of them have really been, apart from these ones, have really been scientific studies. They're more presented as ideas and demonstrations. So now some additional comments. So the thesis is situated between art and science. It sets out to create new types of experiences that can be appreciated at the artistic and emotional level. But on the other hand, it also exploits these technical breakthroughs to carry out scientific studies. I'd be very interested to know more about the tension between these two sides, the artistic and the scientific. The candidate has worked with scientists and I guess with other artists. And how do these two worlds meet each other? How is it possible to deal with both of these sides? In the thesis, there are some explicit statements that sensory motor contingencies in video VR are supported. So sensory motor contingencies means how you use your body to perceive in everyday life. So to perceive in everyday life, you turn your head, you look behind things, you bend down, you look underneath things, you reach out and touch, and of course, the same applies to hearing and so on. Of course, this is only very, very partially possible within video-based VR, as I mentioned earlier. So I'd like to know some more about how sensory motor contingencies in video VR are supported. And another consequence of that is that if in virtual reality you move your head and the images do not update in the way expected, so for example, in video-based VR, you translate your head, but the images won't update. Typically, people will get sick. So I wonder whether this was encountered, and if so, how it was overcome. Regarding the sense of body ownership, what multi-sensory factors are necessary to obtain a sense of ownership over a body? Typically, in model-based VR, we use a combination of first-person perspective, so you look down, you see your body, but the other really critical part is that you move and the body moves with you. Again, that's not directly possible in video-based VR, but I would like to hear more about the experience of the attempt to overcome that. This is more anecdotal. Whenever I've personally tried video-based VR, everything seems too large. I don't know why. Was this problem encountered, and if so, how was it overcome? There is an implicit assumption through the thesis that the greater realism, visual realism of video VR is somehow better than model-based VR, and that participants, because of this, would somehow respond differently between these two systems. Of course, VR first started in the VR in kind of the form we know it first started in the late 1980s, and in the late 1980s, early 90s, you could stand in front of a virtual precipice and be scared out of your life. And the whole precipice was made out of maybe 10 polygons to make it work in real time. People still got scared. So the realism didn't seem to matter. So I'd like to have a bit more discussion on that. I'm more interested to know about, for example, the finding where there were attitude changes even 5 months after the exposure. Does the candidate have any idea about the mechanism of how this works? My final point, which is the longest and maybe the most important, is that the thesis emphasizes the importance of empathy. So I wondered, first of all, how is empathy defined for this thesis? And second, how much does a change in empathy, how much is a change in empathy actually reflected in changes in behavior? So for example, there's a book by Paul Bloom, who's a psychologist at Yale, who argues that empathy in itself typically does not lead to changes in behavior, and actually is quite counterproductive. So I'll quote some things that he says, because I'd be interested to hear the responses about this. So this is from a review of his book, which I've read and is very much worth reading. It says that in the book called Against Empathy, Bloom reveals empathy to one of the leading motivators of inequality and immorality in society. Far from helping us to improve the lives of others, empathy is a capricious and an irrational emotion that appeals to our narrow prejudices. It muddles our judgment and, ironically, often leads to cruelty. In Bloom's own words, he says, when we rely on empathy, we think that a little girl stuck down a well is more important than all of climate change, is more important than tens of thousands of people dying in a faraway country, he says. Empathy zooms us in on the attractive, on the young, on people of the same race. It zooms us in on the one rather than the many, and it distorts our priorities. He argues that rational compassion is the more useful. He says, my rational compassion is meant as two things. You should use rationality to figure out the right thing to do, and compassion is the kick in the pants that makes you do it. And I think compassion works better than empathy in that regard. So later, I'll be very interested to hear any responses to the work of Bloom. So that completes my my talk in response to your presentation. And again, I want to finish by congratulating you, and now turning over the floor to the, I forgot their name, the Custos.
Thank you, opponent.
I think that for the next period in the public examination, we go into the question answer period that you lead, Professor Slater. So you're welcome to begin with your questions, direct question to the respondent.
Good. I couldn't unmute. Okay. So now, as you would have guessed, my first question is the tension between art and science. I'm interested to know more about how this manifested itself, if it did, how you resolved it, how you mainly as an artist, came to grips with the science, how the scientists came to grips with your art, and so on.
Thank you for the question, Professor Slater. Indeed, the field of art and science is full of good intentions. You see this in a way very popular in conferences, festivals, and I would say there's definitely a few challenges when these two types of disciplines meet. Namely, these types of collaborations can yield shallow art or insignificant science. The challenge there, and I think that to pinpoint where that challenge lays, is that typically art is really busy with opening up more questions. Its job is to produce multi-layered experiences that defy, focusing on a particular mechanism, okay? And in that sense, one would say that when you take an artistic experience and you make it into an empirical study, which aims to narrowing down the research question and actually being busy with the mechanism as opposed to the meaning that art may be busy with. So for example, an artistic, scientific questions regarding COVID is what will be the impact of the vaccine? That's a well-defined scientific questions, but an artistic project will be talking about in a world where social distancing, travel restrictions, and social interactions are limited, what would a society like that look like? I think the way that I approach this is, first of all, by entering a lab, I was very curious about not only producing information and experiences for general public, but actually to hear back from the impact of my work. So that for me as an artist was immediately an interesting position, not just to voice my opinions, my artistic view, but also to hear back from the participants. So that's already a first significant relationship between the work that I produce. Now, in terms of the relationship, the intellectual relationship with scholars and scientists, it takes time. So I would say many artists can be inspired by a psychological theory, by some scientific kind of finding or realm that might inspire them. But for this to be meaningful, there is no shortcuts to go in depth and really understand the essence of a particular scientific practice. Now, when that is applied, and I'm talking, it could be months and years, where the bridge of the language between the disciplines is established. So it's a negotiation between the scholars and the scientists to understand what motivates artists, but it's the goal or the job of the artist to truly understand the methods, the type of measures, the type of gathering data, and analyzing the data, and obviously bringing forward the findings. Now, I would say that I had a lot of processes that kind of came into kind of, let's get a negotiation with the scientific practices, where I limited some artistic aspects in favor of a well-defined scientific questions, and vice versa. So having a scientific inspiration, but actually having that applied to artistic process. And I would say through that work in progress, I permitted a very wide kind of playground of these ideas and these inspirations. But it was very important for me that the end result is well contextualized. So when it is an artistic project, namely if it's presented in a gallery museum, but not only, I say at that point, this is an artistic project. And when it's a scientific empirical study, this needs all the conditions, which means, lab control, proper data gathering, and then it produces, in many cases, a scientific paper. So the process could be very interactive, but the outcomes at the end point need to enjoy what each discipline provides. I think Mel needs to be unmuted.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's take a particular example. It's actually one of the things I was going to raise later, but now is a good moment to raise it. Let's think about the example of the checkpoint. And the checkpoint, you had attitude changes that were found 5 months after the actual exposure. So how would you explain this, the mechanism, first of all, from a more artistic point of view, and then from a more scientific point of view?
Thank you for this question, Professor Slater. As an artist, we like to talk about the experiences that we create, or the potential for these experiences to be transformative. Okay, we go about our lives, and there's a lot of mundane encounters and experiences, but every now and then there could be an experience that leaves a mark and remains sometimes for the rest of your life. And I think the idea of virtual reality being a medium that can simulate and elicit an illusion of a real interaction, of a real place, which you would normally not experience. Although quite a few Israelis have been in the military, but such a conflict, such an event might be the first time that they would see this and could leave an impact. So in that sense, I'm coming out with the point of the departure that you can create a rich, in this sense, a disturbing experience, and it may leave a transformative impact that can last for a long time. So that's the perspective of directing and creating an experience, and again, as opposed to a video that you see on screen, the sense of being there, experiencing it firsthand, I think has that power for the long-lasting effect. I will add, we had a very lucky or circumstance that worked for our study, that at the same time of this producing this stimulation, there was a real world event of a soldier actually encountered a lethal scenario where he actually shot a Palestinian protester in a checkpoint, and the actuality of the experiment and the news and the public conversation really played in favor for this to be even more powerful, and probably again contributed to the impact of the intervention.
And so a bit more on that now from the more kind of scientific point of view. So I understand your explanation. Thank you for your answer. It makes a lot of sense. But now, how do you think it works in terms of, let's say, psychological mechanisms or brain mechanisms or whatever?
So here I have to be straightforward. I don't know the answer to that question. I think many of the impacts and effects that we produce are in such early stages. I think every one of the studies here requires a follow-up to further investigate the actual underlying mechanism. So directly to your question, I wouldn't know this underlying mechanism. I would say that we need further investigation to investigate and understand it better.
Okay, what's happening is every time I mute myself, then I try to unmute myself and the system doesn't let me. So I think there's somebody controlling this. So the next question is related to sensory motor contingencies. Obviously, there's a vast difference between sensory motor contingencies in model-based VR, where in principle they could be essentially the same as in physical reality, except maybe for aspects of the haptic side. But in video-based VR, they're rather limited basically to just one dimension, really, head turns. So I wonder if you could expand a bit on that issue, how you dealt with this, how you also dealt with the possible, I'm not saying there was, but the possible rider that it would cause simulator sickness when people move their heads, but the images didn't change.
Yes, thank you for the question, Professor Slater. Yes, indeed, immersive video-based virtual embodiment, it works on one dimension, and I first addressed the last comment regarding motion sickness. A small percentage of participants have reported some motion sickness, but I think really in line to the general sensitivity of any virtual reality experience, and we didn't experience this to be significant. So running 80 participants, we might have one or two subjects basically being rejected in some cases, but or just reporting motion sickness. Now, in the artistic project, we defined it as an exploratory. There were many components which I didn't have time to talk about, and I can mention them here. So we started with the classical random tapping on the hands, same as Botvinnik and Cohen had in their 1998 rubber hand illusion experiment. Then we had contextualized tactile gestures which were corresponding to the specific age. So for the 7-year-old, we had, the experimenter administrate, Piggy went to the market. So it was contextualized, it was more complex, and so on and so forth. It was a relevant gesture per age. We placed a photo which you felt a physical paper. or cardboard that holding that photo. And lastly, there was also a moment where we asked the participants to close their eyes, and there was kind of an imaginary non-visual segment. So it's beyond the scope of the question here now, but I would say that the conclusion was that the sheer visual tactile synchronicity between seeing a hand where it's supposed to be and having human touch had startling effect, more than the narrative contextual gestures, more than holding an object, and yes, more than the imaginary segment. Somehow, this impossibility of being inside a place which is not your own environment, in a body which is not your own body, and having that integration was significantly and powerful enough to create a lot of the emotional impact that these studies produced. We will talk about visual realism as opposed to behavioral realism. I could talk a bit about now, but I'll just mention that I am aware of the power of behavioral realism as opposed to visual one. As an anecdote, in the artistic world, when we talk about object theater and good puppeteers, they can take any object and make you, feel emotions and animate it in a very meaningful way. So we can see any object, and we see this sometimes in robotic studies, definitely in animation, but also in computer graphics, generated virtual reality experiments. When the movement is believable, yes, behavioral realism goes a long way. I would conclude that perhaps I would like to offer that the difference between computer-generated virtual embodiment and video-based virtual embodiment, the technical aspects are very clear and different, but perhaps there's an ontological difference that we should say, these are apples, these are oranges. They're very different. The essence of modeling a virtual human as opposed to capturing a real person ontologically is and fundamentally is very different gesture. I'm not going to go into the technical details of producing eye movement and proper body movement and rendering the realism in CGI, but the fundamental difference of having a particular person with the limitations I'm describing perhaps places the virtual embodiment based on video on a parallel path that can produce interesting, significant, and different types of experiences while compared to CGI-based virtual embodiment.
Thank you very much. As a rider to that, again, this is anecdotal, but we're used to video in our whole lives, television and essentially movies and everything. And I have found that when I've been in video-based environments, because I really know what video is, no matter how real it looks, it never has that impact, because always I know it's like somehow the cognition overrides the normal perceptual responses. And if there's a video-based character frowning at me, I don't care, because part of my mind knows it's video. But if the same happens in a model-based VR, which we're not really used to, with these kind of strange-looking humanoid characters that are not quite human, then it has an effect. So I agree with you that there's a kind of a discontinuity between video-based and model-based. I just wonder if it has that other dimension that we're so used to video-based and we know there's nothing there behind it. We know that if we smile at that video character, is not going to smile back. Whereas in the model-based VR, we've learned that if you smile at the character, it may smile back.
Yes, so this is a very good point, and I think we say video-based production of a virtual environment or virtual embodiment experience, but let's be clear that the quality of the actors, the direction, the shooting is really a whole world which, you know, a lot of the VR experiments and the video-based experiments don't normally enjoy. You know, we all know that the production in labs have some limitations in terms of the production value and the production flow and the end result. I do think, and I want to point out that, yeah, the potential of interactivity has a lot of kind of curiosity that can be generated. And again, from a perspective of storytelling, you know, the possibility to have an unpredicted response is a significant driver for keeping attention, for driving, you know, this tension and release, which stories always work with. You know, what can happen next? And maybe that notion that anything can happen can have a very important aspect of the experience of CGI environments. I would say at this point that what's interesting, in my opinion, and I do hope to enter the realm of virtual humans, that it opens a unique new type of relationship that goes beyond just simulating real people. I think the avatar psychology, like having a relationship with a deliberate non-human entity, is extremely interesting. It can look like a humanoid, but it could be an extended humanoid. It could be a non-humanoid. It could be very intelligent. And I think the more we get affective virtual humans, so that they both can read our emotional and behavioral states and can produce believable emotional and behavioral responses, I think we're looking into a new type of relationships which are fascinating, and I think can take the speculations of how the relationships between humans and computers could be redefined and perhaps also expand the actual human experience.
Yes, thank you. Very, very interesting. To go back to the issue of sensory motor contingencies, the answer that you gave was essentially concerned with embodiment, but I was talking more generally, not just about embodiment, but basically how you perceive in a virtual reality. So what are the implications of this, and also what we've just been talking about, for the different scopes of video VR and model-based VR? So for example, in model-based VR, I can do this. In video-based VR, I can't do that. I can't move. If I move, nothing happens. So that suggests to me that there's a different scope, a different realm of application for these two different modes of VR. And I wondered if you'd had any kind of general thoughts about that difference. I'm particularly interested also because I have an interest in immersive journalism. And the natural inclination of journalists is they take a camera and they film everything. So there's that, possibly for good reasons, that provides a limited scope on what it is they can actually portray, on what it is, how the consumer can interact with that. So the question is your views on the different scopes of these two different modalities.
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think I do agree with your observation. And I would just say that primarily, perhaps, as a general quality of video-based virtual reality, we are talking about an observer type of experience. You are absolutely right. No ability to have object manipulation is a serious limitation, because, and I like to say that one of the problems of VR, the more it becomes realistic, the bigger the problem of not having a body in that environment comes up. But I think there's a few, I would call it tricks in the sleeve, that I'll describe in a second. But I do agree that in terms of the type of experience, we are probably looking at video-based VR as a fly on the wall or an observer, which again could be have a wealth of types of experience, but it's not interactive. I'm not a participant. Okay, a few experiments that I am involved in right now is inspired a lot by computer games. So computer games normally have the interactive mode, and they have the cutscenes. So there's the gameplay, interactive, shooting, running, manipulating objects, and then there's the cutscenes where you sit back, and normally the computer game developers create a very, very cinematic lean back type of experience. So we're talking about lean forward and lean back. And going between these modes has been very inspiring for me. And I actually produced a few experiences that have a reverse but similar type of mechanism. So what I mean is that imagine that you are experiencing a non-interactive scene with all the qualities, could be a particular scene. And of course, mentioning Noni de la Peña and her immersive journalism project. And you can talk about what would be the difference between experiencing this event on the streets of Los Angeles, properly filmed, suppose there was a camera in the real event, as opposed to the computer graphic with its clunkiness. This is an interesting question, but suppose the qualities of video-based VR is then hocketed or alternating with CGI-based interactions. So kind of getting the best of both worlds. And what we are doing right now, and these are projects we're doing for the education realm, you do experience a documentary-based, rich interaction where VR plays a very important role. It could be, for example, a factory tour where you're learning about lean management, for example. But then you are entering a CGI-based room, and there you are confronted with a task which is computer generated and enabling you agency. So this idea is basically, and that's where my work is going, not to be a medium kind of dependent and not to be associated with only one, I don't know if it's a trick or a pony, but not to stick to only one available technique, opens up, I think, what the industry, the creative community and scientific community can enjoy. Let's choose the right technique, choose the right way to produce a bit of content, or choose or understand what research question can enjoy which technique, what artistic project can use the available technique to realize it. And if you think of it in a flexible way, this might lead very impactful experiences.
Thank you very much. Yes. So that leads me on to a related issue, which is that there was the late Dr. Randy Pausch. He was one of the kind of pioneers in virtual reality. And he made the point many years ago that just as when sound was introduced in cinema, and when cinema evolved from theater, it took many years before the grammar of this new media could be understood and exploited. Like you mentioned, the cut. This is something that's obviously learned in cinema, but it's not so obvious that it could be used in theater. So he suggested that the same would happen in virtual reality, that we, at the moment, he was talking maybe 15 years ago, but I still think it's true today. We have no idea really what the grammar of telling a story in virtual reality should be. Are you moving any closer to that?
First of all, I totally agree. And I would say that that's the underlayer goal of my work, is really to try to identify, first of all, the basic building blocks. So the vocabulary basically evolving into a grammar. And yes, I feel that every production, every experiment, every art project, there's a component that I'm starting to kind of realize, or leaning towards what would be eventually becoming a grammar. I would say that when I look at it from a kind of a bird's eye view, and I look at the creative community, and this is a very important comment that relates to the history of the arts, having and as well the media arts, having available tools as a playground, literally being able to experiment. I do remember that in the mid-90s, where digital video came into the hands of independent film creators, really advanced and pushed forward a lot of the cinematic language as we know it today. And that's what I hope for VR to happen both for the creative community and for the actual articulation of finally a grammatic and a language. And then, I'd like to always kind of point that, a new technology emerges. After some period of time, a grammar evolves, and I definitely think we are in the early stage. After the grammar is there, emerges a new type of psychology. Because when we say cinematic language, you'd go in the street and you'd see two cranes moving, and you'd say, "Oh, that's very choreographical," or "That's like cinema." The difference between reality and cinema, 100 and more years after the birth of that medium, has really mixed into our actual experience. So as the grammar is there and the language is formed, it creates a new type of psychology, and then come in the philosophers and and understand the world and try to formulate it. Sometimes it's not that linear. The philosophy of virtual reality has been around for several years and decades. But to answer directly to your questions, I feel very privileged to be involved in both academic, artistic, and sometimes in industry projects. Every project could be as simple as it is. I really try to understand, what does that project contribute to my understanding of a grammatical structure, eventually becoming, the language.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting and actually very exciting. So I want to return for a moment to the issue of realism. Several years ago, there was a professor of vision science at University of California, Berkeley, whose name was Lawrence Stark. And he put forward the notion that virtual reality works because reality is virtual. And what he meant by that is that, well, the example he gave is that if you monitor someone's eyes, so with eye tracking, and you see where they look when they first go to a new place, or that when they first look at an object, there's first of all, the eye tracking is random, but very quickly it settles down to them looking at a few focal points and then movements between those focal points. So what's happening is that you very, very quickly sampled the environment. Like you go in, you say, I'm in a kitchen. You look at a few points. Yeah, it's a kitchen. There's an oven. There's this, there's that. And that's it. And you think, I know this environment. Well, you don't think. Your perceptual system makes a model, an internal model of the environment based on your whole history. And you fill in all the details yourself. So what he meant is that a very poor, in terms of computer graphics, virtual reality works because we do the modeling ourselves inside. You go in a virtual environment, you see an oven, you see a sink and a tap. Right, it's a kitchen. And already you kind of know the whole environment. Now, is there the danger with video-based or extremely realistic computer graphics that somehow it will prevent the brain from doing that modeling and somehow paradoxically make everything less real because you can't do the normal things that you would do? So my example again that I had before, in the early 90s, you go in a virtual environment with maybe 20 or 30 polygons, very simple, no texture mapping, nothing. You see a precipice and you jump back, your heart rate increases and so on. So the old kind of, or maybe simplified kind of computer graphics realism, it really works in producing effects. Maybe the equivalent in extreme realism, but not quite exactly real, maybe it wouldn't have the same effect.
Yes, thank you for this question. I think it's a fascinating one, and there's a lot that I can relate to that spans my work in theater, film, and research labs. So yes, virtual reality, there's a big question. Why did it not become broadly accepted device? Why is it not relevant for the entertainment market? You would expect, with all the hype and the money spilled by Facebook and Google and the studios and the film festivals that really eyed, this new emerging storytelling tool. And I think I have some intermediate, humble conclusions that I think can contribute to the question that you're asking. So first of all, storytelling is really based on taking the viewer, the listener, any type of medium by the hand, taking him by the hand. So if I'm a person sitting around the fire, this is situated in a focal point. The darkness, maybe the sights and sounds are there for everybody to concentrate on me, and the pleasure of actually generating the information and interplay of what you tell, what you don't. Of course, it's very interactive. You see the faces of the people around you, but it's all about drawing attention. And that is why cinema has become such a successful and powerful medium for entertainment, for politics, for consumer culture, because you have a frame. When you create content, and theater makers will definitely say, and filmmakers, or script writers, it's most of the times what you don't show that is more interesting and powerful than what you do show. So the frame itself in 2D video already limits, the peripheral information that might interfere with what you want to direct. The close-up, which obviously is a technique in cinema, but not in virtual reality. In virtual reality, a close-up is basically something, an object or a person being literally placed in front of you. So my bottom line conclusion is that in VR, you see too much, and your comment is definitely valid, and I agree. But here comes the knowledge that we as theater makers and filmmakers, we are able to direct the right amount of information needed to portray what you want to achieve. So it is no coincidence that when we talk about theater, we're talking about the black box, we're talking about the spotlight, we're talking about the object, and the beauty of theater is exactly this minimalism that could yield very powerful experiences. Now, I would say, no matter what medium you use, it could be CGI with a trillion polygons. If you have a well-directed scene, you will not be tempted to have, all the details. And sometimes when I work with studios, let's put here, and put this, and this will move. No, it's really very carefully designing the environment, choosing what to leave out, and you could enjoy the same quality and poetics that you mentioned and effectiveness of the early low poly experiences that you could come in and the experience a space and direct attention on the very few objects there still could be done in high poly, well directed properly. And same goes for video base. In some cases, if that's what you're looking to achieve, if you want to focus on various important objects, you would direct, place, and stage that environment accordingly. However, there are some applications where the maximalism of, I call it Where's Waldo type of experience, where you're asking the participant to be immersed in the Turkish bazaar type of overwhelming sights and sounds, that might be a valid, goal, reason for creating the maximalistic type of realism, either scripted or documentary. So again, to summarize, it's really all about what you want to achieve and a well-directed scene, which maybe relates us to the initial question about science and art. I think it's not only artists being like content providers for the PI, that if they understand, the cognitive, behavioral, emotional aspects, and have done the journey of understanding the emerging vocabulary and grammar of virtual reality, this could yield very, very synergetic experiences that both sides really contribute to achieving an experience, again, to what goal they are constructed for.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting. Yes. It reminds me that some time ago, it was almost certainly in the 1990s, I was at SIGGRAPH in Los Angeles, and I led a kind of workshop on the issue of presence in virtual reality. and the audience was packed. And in particular, it was packed with people from Los Angeles, Hollywood. And what they were really interested in is, how can you possibly tell a story in virtual reality where you have no idea where the participant or viewer might be looking and to what they're paying attention? And so just as some crucial, critical event happens, they happen to be busy with something else and they miss it. Have you come across that and thought about it? I've still never heard a satisfactory answer to that problem that was kind of driving these Hollywood people crazy.
So yes, there was actually 2 full years which I was busy with the production of a narrative VR experience. But I'll start by addressing, absolutely right, VR, you can see too much. It's very easy to miss the key action, the key interaction that the director wanted you to actually experience. But I'll briefly describe, with the time that we have, a production that I think can significantly contribute to this question in terms of how does immersive storytelling actually manifest itself when totally thinking and being aware of the medium, its limitations, its advantages. So I'm going to tell you briefly about a production, a very large scale production that never came to reality because there was no business model, but nevertheless, it has a lot of interesting means to overcome the question that you are raising: how to draw attention, how to tell a story. So this production was actually meant to be a CGI event-based experience. So it was supposed to be a theater established in Camden Town, where people come in and wear a backpack and can roam around a virtual environment. The first stage was that you had a virtual human address you and interact very basically towards you. The theme, if I may share, was kind of a remake of Jack the Ripper. Okay, so we chose already kind of a horror type of genre, and you can of course imagine what happens when you don't notice something and when that something kind of surprises you. And we started with placing this experience in reality. So you entered kind of the same theater that you actually would see as a physical one, and you are in it was 2019, here and now, asked to wear a headset. The first element that you had, you were holding a remote control. That physical remote control was an audio guide. Okay, as an audio guide, we had the sound come from that remote control. So here we had a mechanism of a physical object talking about sensory or at least tactile visual synchronicity, spatialized sound, and there we had a mechanism of a guide telling you, look right, look left. So it is a creative way to actually make you look whenever you wanted to go or whatever you wanted the participant to see. And thereon, you walk through the museum. I'll quickly roam through a few more elements. You enter an elevator. The elevator had a rotating platform. So it's a very interesting mechanism. It's like, you know, the famous plank walk that generates, you know, the very physical response. Being in an elevator, nothing moves, but if the floor rotates, again, you have a physical kind of response that simulates the environment and makes you believe that you are in this place and you're moving from one place to another. Lastly, we had in the theme like a ghost that would further help you kind of look around and make you follow her. So we had, again, the tourist guide. And then when we talked about in many conversations and with creatives and festivals and conferences, we always talk about the techniques to draw attention. So it could be audio, could be light. In one scene, we had this same audio guide became a flashlight, which was, again, another very interesting way to bridge the subjective experience and the world. Wherever you point would reveal all the jars with the body parts, but you had the sense that you are impacting the world, the environment around you. And of course, what happens in the end, that flashlight becomes a knife and the actors around you accuse you. So there was this very precise techniques that, one, helped you help focus the attention of the viewer very creatively. Secondly, We had all kind of techniques to bridge the relationship between you and the world. And the interesting question is it only anecdotal? Is this production and these ideas kind of are good for this one type, one sort of one-off type of production, or could this be generalized to what we are looking for as a grammar? I'll just mention one cinematic reference. In my research, as you read, I referred to first-person perspective cinema. So there was one example from the 1940s, and then zooming forward to the 1990s was like Hardcore Henry, a complete movie film from the first-person perspective. Of course, there's Joe Malkovich. And the question is that a genre or just a very specific subset of artistic design for a particular film? So the answer is still obviously open. I think the place where VR will fall into in terms of storytelling will be somewhere between the idea that I had not only having or maybe hocketing between gameplay and experiential, so like lean back, lean forward experiences, and perhaps the more accessible CGI and room scale VR is going to be around. We'll see more experiments that will yield, meaningful ways to tell a story. But the challenge is definitely there, and it's an open-ended question.
Thanks very much. So my final questions are about empathy. So it will be interesting to hear what you took empathy to be. So I don't want to go so formal as say your definition, but what is empathy in the way you were working with it? And had you come across this counter work, like Paul Bloom illustrates that, but there's many other authors that actually shows that empathy is not necessarily the best way to change attitudes and behaviors. Yesterday, we had a paper published, the typical thing that's done for VR as an empathy machine is you put someone in the body of an outgroup and you subject them to all kinds of indignities. And somehow this is supposed to increase their empathy and lead to new behaviors. And what we found is that when you do that, actually it can lead to increased implicit bias against that group. So I wondered if you've thought about these ideas and what your views are about empathy and its role in producing change. As another simple, again, obvious example that we all know, you walk through the street and you see someone homeless living on the street asking for change. People give them change, but it's extremely, extremely rare for one to do anything more than that. Go and help them find accommodation, take them into your home or whatever. So is empathy the way forward?
Thank you for this question, Professor Slater. I think I would like first to start with some definitions, and I would like to differentiate sympathy, empathy, and compassion. And I think sympathy is what we call recognizing pain in other. Empathy would be actually being able to feel the other's pain. And lastly, compassion is really the motivational, the wish and the ability and perhaps the actual action of doing something to elevate the pain of other. And the borders are kind of fluid, I think definitely between empathy and compassion. We broke down empathy into two sub components. One is empathetic distress. So it's the actual feeling the pain of the other, and empathetic care, again, more related to compassion, the wish to elevate pain. I'll mention that the mechanism I believe works for the motivational aspect of empathy works in VR is due to the fact that if the social co-presence of me and the target is established, so I believe that I'm sharing that same place, that same space, the ability to reach out and put my hand on her or his hand is there. So the potential for doing that very basic empathetic gesture is there. So I think that's kind of an idea. Many times you see people putting VR maybe for the first time, you see them do this. So they want to reach out. Again, they believe that it's there. And if you believe that a person in front of you is experiencing pain, and it might be a close person, you might want to hold his hand. So empathy is, a warm feeling. And I think the questions that you asked are so important. Definitely when we're talking about VR for good, or any maybe greenwashing of force for good. We see this all over, and this really goes into political standpoints. Does the West need to put money into Africa and to have philanthropy, or should they stop abusing its resources and people? So I think empathy for itself is not good or bad. I would generally say that practicing empathy is a good thing. Is it a magical tool that we can expect from it to generate social change? Obviously not. Of course, this kind of guilt type of philanthropy, giving the $1 to that homeless person, but what would you feel? Would you put him in your car? It's probably a gap that VR, or I would definitely say it's a gap worth investigating. To what extent are you willing to reach out and go from your comfort zone, and willing to spend time, resources, and maybe kind of an empathetic kind of listening moment that would definitely need a specific investigation. So I would say that what you pointed out as the danger of empathy, and my work with various psychologists definitely put it in some sort of question mark, is not the answer for everything. It could definitely yield biases. It could definitely yield what we call greenwashing. But the scope of this question is too big. Now, should this be, and probably will be on my research path, I would definitely want to see what yields pro-social activities or anti-social activities. To what extent were you willing to have a sacrifice? That's really the point where we're talking about social change and actually helping someone else. If giving $1 or $1 million is something that you don't even feel, you don't have to sacrifice something in favor of giving to someone else, then that's probably a point where it's worth investigating. What is that cutoff point? What is that threshold where you're willing to spend your time, spend some of your resources that you have to reallocate from your own to be a very interesting measure to what effect is actually the motivational results in action. So the scope is very big, it's very interesting, but I definitely think VR being the behavioral, or I would even say the ultimate behavioral lab, requires more investigation, and I'm very eager to contribute in the next years into this important question.
Thank you very much. Before I move on to my summing up, are there any last things that you would like to say?
No, I thank you for your in-depth questions and the opportunity to have this conversation. Your work has been an inspiration for me and my creative community. And we think that, again, combining the creative and the artistic research in terms of language, impact, emotions, with cognitive, psychological, neurologic, neuroscience inputs may yield, significant benefits on a societal level. And again, I just want to say that these important questions are definitely inspiring and will definitely find their place in future projects. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now I move on to a phase where I do the summing up. So first of all, thank you very much for your illuminating and extremely eloquent and well thought out answers to the questions. And I will just go through some points concerning with evaluation. I was asked to evaluate the thesis on a number of grounds. The first one was new scientific knowledge and artistic creation. So as I said before, you have essentially developed a new methodology for some level of achievement of interaction in video VR, bridging the gap between model-based VR and video VR to some extent, to the extent that's possible. I'm sure you'll have further ideas in the future about how to do this. And as I said before, I thought the techniques introduced were quite ingenious, both from the kind of technical point of view and the artistic effect. The second thing is that it does the thesis set forward new findings. So it clearly does demonstrate new findings. All of the scenarios and the scientific papers point this out. Some, in particular, the work on that exploited the checkpoint scenario was extremely interesting, and I think this kind of thing can be taken forward more. I doubt, as you said, if it's going to bring peace to the Middle East, but maybe it's a tiny step along the road. But anyway, your thesis won't be evaluated to the extent that it brings peace to the Middle East, luckily. The third one, is it an independent contribution? Yes, of course, like anyone, you've collaborated with many people, but it was very clearly obvious from reading your dissertation that you have your own completely independent thoughts, which are unique and novel. And there's no doubt that this has been demonstrated. And the last point is research methods. Do they fulfill the criteria for scientific or art-based research? Again, the research methods clearly do. The embodiment methods that you've used, especially the attempt to meet yourself and the attempt to give some way that the person can move and get corresponding feedback in a video-based VR is very exciting and very interesting. And the research has been carried out and reported in a methodologically sound way. And of course, as I saw in the thesis, all the work has received appropriate ethics approval. So my opinion is that the whole in terms of the thesis and your presentation to me has been exemplary. And the dissertation itself was written in a clear and linguistic correct way. The articles you've had some published in international journals. You've made a significant number of independent contributions. The findings are exceptionally significant in my opinion. I think it's blazing a new trail. Yes, blazing a new trail. I was just worried there about my metaphor, but it's correct. It has both scientific merit and extremely high artistic merit, and it was defended well in the public examination. So my recommendation would be that certainly this is in the top 20% of dissertations that I've examined, and I don't know how many I've examined, but it's quite a lot. And I would therefore recommend that the thesis that passes, and also with a distinction. So I think that concludes my my response in this. Thank you very much again for inviting me and being part of this.
Thank you, opponent. If anyone wishes to make any comment concerning my dissertation, please ask the custos for the floor.
Okay, so then I will declare the proceedings closed, and